Spanish. Yeah? So having said that, language is a very important starting point for new ideas, for new concepts. You have to know your own language. Not because you should write in your own language. You should, but that's for the purpose of communication. But the language should be seen as a repository of concepts. So for example, when we say orang laut, if you are thinking in a Eurocentric way, the orang laut simply become objects of analysis, of ethnographic studies, and historical studies, and archival research, and so on. That's all. But if you're thinking of it theoretically, then we want to understand orang laut as a concept, in contrast to what that leads us to conceptualizing the nature of Malay society, or the nature of the Malay world. This is how I think we approach concept formation. Does that answer your?
Yeah.
But then you raise the problem of you are forced to translate into English, and you also raise the problem of you end up using Western frameworks.
You said that actually leads to my second question.
Wait, let me deal with the first question. I don't think those are problems. I would never suggest that we should not apply any Western framework. Right? In fact, I didn't have time to discuss this. What I would say is that when you do decolonial work, there are different levels of it. Okay? At one level, you can do decolonial work by engaging in a critical application of Western ideas. I was asking you about Huang Wenxiang. Yeah. Now, as far as I know, Huang Wenxiang was writing as early as the 1930s. Right? He was from Taiwan, isn't it? Yeah, he was from Taiwan. And then he came to Taiwan. This is a very interesting example of, this is 1930s. It's an interesting example of a non-Western scholar who had an influence on Western scholarship. It's very rare. Even today it is rare, but in the 1930s, this is almost 180 years ago. It's quite interesting. He had an influence on the development of the field of culturology. The field that Western scholars, especially American scholars, was developing. It was called, they were trying to say that there is a field of study of culture that is distinct from sociology. Because sociology is about social systems, about structure. But when we study culture, we're studying the content. So there should be a different field devoted to the study of culture. They call it culturology. Now there were some scholars in America who were influenced by Huang Wenxiang's formulation and proposal for this new field. He wrote several pieces, a couple of books, and several articles. Now, to me, that would be, he's operating within the Western field, but his contribution is original. So to me, that's already important, right? Now, you also have scholars from the non-West who take a Western concept but critique it and apply it in a creative manner. For example, Marx's concept of Asiatic mode of production. In the work of Marx, it's an Orientalist concept, but it's based on the idea that Asiatic societies are static, they cannot change, and change can only come about through external forces like colonization. So China, for example, was an Asiatic mode of production. There was no private property, there was no possibilities for an independent bourgeois class to emerge because the emperor owned everything. This was a distorted and wrong image of India and China and other Asiatic societies, but it was a construction in their minds, right? But there have been some scholars who have removed the Eurocentric elements from Marx's Asiatic mode of production theory and then applied it to the study of some Asian societies. So the Asiatic mode of production becomes a centralized mode of production as distinct from the decentralized feudal mode of production in Europe. But it's historicized, it's made to reflect what is actually happening in history rather than an idealized, abstract, orientalist notion. Now, that's operating within Western scholarship, but it's still critical and useful because we cannot deny that there are no Western concepts that are relevant and applicable, right? But I would say that to do decolonial work, we have to go beyond that. Not to throw out the Western knowledge, but to identify other ways of knowing. So there are Western theories of nationalism, some of which are useful and we should study. But Tagore also had an approach to nationalism. So we should be looking at Tagore, comparing Tagore with existing Western approaches, and possibly, forming hybrid accounts. This is part of the creative process. And going even further, looking at non-Western knowledge systems, and not saying that non-Western knowledge systems are only applicable to their country of origin, right? So, for example, Rizal, Jose Rizal, has an explanation for the lazy native. It's part of a sociology of colonialism. Now, our usual approach is, first of all, we're not interested in Rizal except for his information about Philippines. But we're not interested in his conceptualizing. We don't think of him as a theoretician. So that's one thing we have to correct. So we have to look at Rizal's conceptualizing. So for example, how does he conceptualize laziness? What is his explanation for laziness in colonial society? How is laziness understood in terms of the structure of colonial society? And how does laziness, and he talks about exploitation, how do laziness and exploitation fit in his theory of colonial society? Okay, we have to think of Rizal as an origin of ideas, not just as somebody who supplied some information about Filipino society. Secondly, we have to think of Rizal in universal terms. Does Rizal's perspective on colonial society, his theory of colonial society, help us to understand colonialism in Brazil? Or colonialism in Taiwan? Maybe reading Rizal leads us to think about certain questions to ask about Japanese colonialism in Taiwan, or Korea, or the Caribbean, French, or whatever colonialism in the Caribbean, or Spanish colonialism in Latin America, to think in universal terms. So there's a movement from first of the local, look at the local, look at Rizal, look at local languages as repositories of concepts, develop, theorize and abstract from that, and then move to a universal level. Now all of this can be done. It can be done in Tagalog, it can be done in Spanish, it can be done in English. That's really not the issue. The issue of concept formation is understanding. And of course you must know the language so that you have the source of the concepts. Whether you want to write in Tagalog or English is another matter. If you want to communicate to people who do not read English, but you also want to communicate with people who only know English because you want those ideas to cross national boundaries, right? So does that answer your question?
Pretty much, yeah. But still, I think the problem remains in terms. Well, I understand this difference between language and understanding. I think that when we conceptualize concepts, even if we explain them in English, like this is what our professors tell us when we write our papers back then in the bachelor's. I remember so clear that they actually prefer us to write in Filipinos, in Tagalog, because you can better explain a concept, like a local concept, using the local language. I mean, there's no better way to enlighten people about the local concept, but like the best way to explain the local concept is by using the local language, because it's part of one habitus, or it's part of the same system, the knowledge system that you're talking about. But when we put that particular knowledge into the academic sphere, and in order for us to position it in a global sense, like for example, Rizal's work, his criticism of Antonio de Morga's account of the laziness of the Filipinos, explaining that they're lazy at this time of day because they overwork at this blah blah blah. He speaks not in our own language. So what I'm trying to say here is that when we actually write, we are also concerned about the audience. And as we understand Rizal's audience is not necessarily the Filipinos back then. And the audience of Rizal, he wrote it in Spanish, was actually the Spaniards in Spain, but because back then they also have this concern of provincializing the Philippines as the province of Spain, etc., etc. I will not go into details. But again, we go back to this concern of making other people understand us in their own terms. Like, I think the criticism of Rizal, for example, of the Spanish colonialism in the Philippines did not necessarily apply or did not necessarily explore so much into the Filipino concept, but he actually spoke of the Filipino the phenomenon in the Philippines using this Spanish language, Spanish concepts that the Spaniards can understand. So,
right, but whatever it is, whatever his intentions were, why he wrote in Spanish, you can't deny that his work, his theory of laziness, was a critique of colonial rule. Right? It was a critique of the colonial government. It was a critique of the Spanish Catholic Church. His two novels were a depiction of the nature of exploitation and the horrors of living in colonial society, and also a speculation about the possibilities of revolution. All of that was done in Spanish, and we can criticize him for writing in Spanish and not in Tagalog, but that is a separate issue. The point is, even though he wrote in Spanish, it was a decolonial work. It was a critique of coloniality. It was an exposition of the nature of colonial society. So in our assessment of Rizal, we need to make those distinctions.
Thank you.
The second question?
Oh, that's the second question.
That's the second
yes,
question.
it's like it just connects to the first question. Thank you.
And it's very important, there is a problem of translation. There's always some loss of meaning.
Yes, actually there's a book about it written in the Philippines, The Plunder of Language, wherein they say that when we cannot read, for example, sorry I talk so much. Of course, I live up to the name. There's this Spanish concept, sin. We call it sala in Filipino, but when it was taught to the Filipinos, sala means like, in order for you to correct sala, you have to repeat it many times in order for you to perfect it. But the Catholic concept of sin, you should not repeat it. So there's always this problem in translating things, and when you try to translate something, you're forced to think in another language, which falls back to this concern on how to start into creating something that's outside the Western colonial thinking. So yeah.
But I think we should make a distinction between loss of meaning. There's always some loss of meaning in translation, which is one end of the continuum. But at the other end of the continuum, you have distortion, right?
Yes.
And I think it is possible to avoid distortion. So, for example, religion. The term religion, as it is used today, is not, when we call Islam a religion, I think it is not such a big distortion as it would have been 500 years ago. Because 500 years ago, when you said religion, if you use the word religion, it means you would have been a European, right? Because people who were using religion were Europeans. Now, 500 years ago in Europe, religion meant Christianity. It meant Christianity. When you said religion, it meant Christianity. No other belief system was called a religion. Since I think a couple of centuries after the emergence of Christ, when Christianity became the official religion of Rome, the word religion meant Christianity, and that continued until the 19th century, more or less until the 19th century. It's only in the 19th century where people started, thinkers, philosophers, writers, started to refer to other faiths as religion. Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, and so on and so forth. So the history of the term religion, at one point in time, when you say Islam is religion, people are thinking in terms of Christian categories, right? So, for example, they said, this was in the Middle Ages, they would say this, when you talk about Islam and you talk about Muhammad, they imagine that it is like Christianity, that you have a savior like Jesus who died for his sins, and that religion, although the people of that religion worship Christ, worship God, but then it's called after a man called Jesus, Christ, Christianity, right? So they did the same thing with Islam. The Europeans called Islam Mohammedanism, because they're looking at the religion of Islam through the lens of Christianity. Now this is the result of applying the term, the concept religion to Islam in a time